I'm going to start this morning actually by repeating some things that Chris said in his preface to his remarks, that what I'm about to share with you today springs very much from my own personal experience as an American leading an intercultural Christian ministry over 15 years in Asia. Much of that time in Indonesia, but also with partnerships and interaction with Christian brothers and sisters, and also with government officials in about a dozen different Asian countries. To some extent, that feels like broad experience, but I'm acutely aware that it's also limited. And so I'm sharing this with you in the hopes that God will speak to you and that He will give you tools and equip you for the service that you are called, each one of you are called to perform in His name's sake. This morning we're going to be talking about asymmetric power in leadership relationships. You heard Doug Johnson yesterday talk about asymmetric power. It's a term that actually comes from the international relations realm. Refers to two parties having an imbalance of power, one having a lot of power, one having very little power, and then trying to relate to one another in that context. Doug used it yesterday with regard to the war on terror, where the world's superpower is engaged in a conflict with a non-state actor, and that those differences create unique problems for nations. But this same concept can apply to any relationship where you have a major partner, a muscular, large, powerful partner, and then one that has much less power. So we have a central thesis, a core thesis that I'm going to tell you right up front what I'm hoping you bring away from this. And that is that asymmetry like this, an asymmetry of power, will create distortions or turbulence in your relationships with the people that you work with. As Americans, as people who are involved in Christian ministry organizations around the world, we do have power. We project power, whether we know it or whether we like it or not. And so it behooves us as Christian leaders in the 21st century, in light in particular of the rise of our partners in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, it behooves us to be aware of the power that we project, and then to work to compensate or mitigate for that as we are involved in our leadership relationships. In Asia, I've talked about this in terms of the difficulties of an elephant dancing with a deer. It's complicated and it's difficult, and yet that's the call that we as Christian leaders, particularly those of us who are Americans in this room, working with Wycliffe USA, working with other major Christian organizations, those are the things that we are needing to face. What we are looking at here is a dimension of impact awareness. Impact awareness is our perception of how we influence others. Every leader needs to have some sense of how they're coming across to those that they are working with, whether it's a partner, whether it's those that they are leading, whether it's their boss with whom they are relating. Impact awareness is a crucial skill, and power asymmetry, the fact that we have power and that affects the way others relate to us, is a crucial skill that I'm hoping we can develop over the course of this morning's discussions. Impact awareness, power, has an effect on all kinds of relationships. You as leaders have an impact. Your power has an impact on those whom you lead, those who report to you. This deals with individual relationships. It also deals between organizations. Powerful organizations and less powerful organizations have relationships, and that power dynamic does have an effect. It's within our organizations, internally and externally, as we relate outside our organizations with others. So this morning I want to talk about two sources of power: hard power and group identity. These are somewhat related terms, but they will be a helpful, rough and ready way of organizing our thinking as we go forward to talk about the influence of power in our relationships. And then I'm going to conclude at the end of our time this morning with a few thoughts about how to mitigate, how to compensate for the impact of power as we work with other people. So we're going to look first at hard power. Several people have referenced actually Otto von Bismarck this morning. Hard power is finds its roots in the 19th century realpolitik, the fact that a nation has military and economic capacity to coerce others to do what they want. That's the core of the concept of hard power. Germany and in Central Europe used that kind of muscle to get other countries to do what they wanted them to do. And it's contrasted in the last 8 years or so with the concept of soft power. Soft power is the ability to influence and encourage people so that they choose to do, so that they want to do what you want them to do. So it's not a coercive kind of a thing, it's an attractive kind of a thing. When a culture or a nation is attractive, they have values that other nations appreciate, they have a culture that is an attractive culture, then that draws others to want to be partners, to want to be allies. There is a soft power that's not, you don't count it in terms of missiles and aircraft carriers or how big your budget in foreign aid is. There's something else that's that is less tangible, but nonetheless very significant in terms of international relations. What I'm suggesting here with regard to hard power and soft power is that these concepts also have multiple applications. This isn't just for international relations. It also has very tangible applications to our Christian ministry context, our context as leaders in Christian organizations. And that's what we're going to focus on this morning, are those kinds of contexts. So first of all, we'll look at hard power affecting individual relationships, us as leaders relating to other people. To the extent that you are a leader, you've been entrusted with responsibility, you've been entrusted to manage or administrate other people, you have power. Your position gives you authority, it gives you power. And this is something that we as Christians, as was mentioned earlier this morning, it makes us feel uncomfortable. It makes us feel uncomfortable to talk about people having power or that we have power. I remember several years ago, a man who was one of my direct reports, we came upon an issue that we deeply disagreed about, very strongly disagreed. And he was in such strong disagreement, despite our ability to talk and try to work it through, that he went to my boss to appeal his case. I had made a decision with which he very strongly disagreed. He went to my boss to try to make the case for why his opinion was the right one in this particular case. And it was reported back to me that one of the things he commented as he went to my boss to appeal over my head, he said, "I feel like David. I feel like David facing Goliath." You know, regardless of the merits of his opinion and my opinion, don't you feel with him in that sense of vulnerability, that sense of weakness in the face of, in trying to debate a case against a leader that was very well respected in the organization? It was a very difficult position for him to be in, and yet that's something that people who relate to leaders feel. And you, as you are in a growing position of leadership, will face the same thing. People will see you, and it will start to change the way they relate to you. As Linda and I moved from being our full-time assignment being translators for the Jawa people to my full-time assignment being the country director of our work in Indonesia, one of the grieving parts of that was that our relationships with many people changed. We were no longer just one of the guys. We couldn't just do things with other people. Some of our friendships changed through that process. It was a time of loss for us because we were no longer the same, had the same opportunities to fellowship with people. in my own experience, one of the ways that the hard power of positions of leadership it affects my relationships with those that work with me is in the area of hearing unpleasant truth. People are tempted, and the more responsibility that you get in life, the more people will be tempted to shield you from bad news, shield you from things that are not happy. They would prefer to not let their boss know that when things aren't going well. They're a book called Primal Leadership by Goldman, Boyatzis, and McKee called this the CEO disease. The more responsibility you get, the more likely it is that people are going to try to not let you know. And in the intercultural context, this is exacerbated about 100 times. Even when we all share the same culture, there is some temptation for this kind of behavior. But once you have a multicultural team, then even more so, people are going to be unsure about whether they can risk telling you unpleasant truth, things that are difficult, will be difficult for you to hear. That is part of the hard power that you have as a leader in an organization. But hard power doesn't only affect individual relationships. It also affects groups, big groups and little groups. I was introduced to the concept of hard power, first of all, by an Asian colleague. We were walking along a street in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and going to have dinner one evening. And he was telling me about a book he had read about hard and soft power, and introduced me to those terms, military and economic power being hard power, and this attractiveness of culture and ability to influence as soft power. This was a tremendous education. We were going along down the street that you have as a leader in an organization. But hard power doesn't only affect individual relationships. It also affects groups, big groups and little groups. I was introduced to the concept of hard power, first of all, by an Asian colleague. We were walking along a street in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and going to have dinner one evening. And he was telling me about a book he had read about hard and soft power, and introduced me to those terms, military and economic power being hard power, and this attractiveness of culture and ability to influence as soft power. This was a tremendous education. We were going along down the street, and I was learning so much. And then, as we turned into the restaurant, we were going to, and our conversation was going to take a turn then too. The last thing he said before we walked in the door was, "SAL has a lot of hard power." I felt like I'd been set up. But it was a comment that stuck with me and that I thought about for a long time afterwards. What did he mean that SAL had a lot of hard power? And not just SAL, but there are all kinds of organizations, particularly American organizations in my own experience, who carry with them, whether they know it or not, a huge amount of hard power. You know, the kinds of things that I could think of in SAL are the things that I've noted here. Our budget is massive compared to the budgets of most of our partners that we work with in Asia. The sheer size, number of people that we can bring to bear in our operations is overwhelming compared to what many of our Asian partners are able to recruit and deploy. I think about education. You know, the only institutions in this world that have more PhDs and MAs than SIL are major universities. And then that is intimidating. That is hard power. That is muscle in terms of organization. Think about the international stature in SIL in terms of the work that we have with UNESCO, the things that Catherine mentioned yesterday. That's recognition. That is a hard power as well, that other organizations look to us and they are intimidated. Not just with us, with SIL, with Wycliffe. Think about the other organizations, the other 500-pound gorillas on the scene, Campus Crusade, the International Mission Board, huge mission organizations, World Vision. Think about Focus on the Family here in the United States, massive influential organizations. And other smaller organizations have a difficulty figuring out how to relate to them. The difficulties in partnering are because we have, the large organization has so much that they can bring to the table in a discussion. And my Asian partners have come to me and said, you know, we have so little that we can offer. How can this possibly be a partnership with all that you bring, and when we can bring so little? What does this mean? What does partnership mean in this kind of a context? How can it be respectful and equitable? How can we have a mature partnership in this situation? And you know, what is so sad is that our normal way of operating as Americans, with American kinds of organizational intuitions and assumptions, is that we can deploy our resources, money and people on a project, we can accomplish things, and our partners feel bulldozed. And they can feel bulldozed even though they share the same goals that we do, and they want to see the same things happen, but they feel run over by this massive organization that they're trying to relate to. You know, Jimmy Carter, American president in the 1970s, near the end of his term of office in 1980, said that American foreign policy needs a measure of self-restraint. He actually used a different word, that he used timidity. He said, American foreign policy needs timidity. And truth be told, he was hung out to dry by the media for making the comment. It was not a well-received suggestion with the American public at that time. But within the Christian missionary context, the Christian intercultural work context, there is a lot to be said for self-restraint, for some care as we work with other partners and other groups. You know, if we go back to the elephant metaphor, the elephant only has to shift the weight a little bit, and you knock your partner across the room. And so we need to be aware that those of us who are working and representing as leaders, representing powerful organizations in the Christian context, we need to have that kind of care and sensitivity as we work with other organizations that are far less powerful than we are. Okay, we're going to be looking a little bit at group identity now. Group identity that affects leadership relationships. My introduction to group identity issues was a number of years ago in an international conference. It was a Wycliffe conference, and after lunch one day, the first person to come to the podium was the director of our Japanese Wycliffe organization, and this is what he said. He said, in recent months, my government has apologized for what our country did during World War II. And he said, as a Japanese person, I feel like I also need to apologize. He said, my country made a terrible mess of things in Asia during those years, and many, many people suffered. He said, I'm truly sorry. And then at that time, several of the leaders of Wycliffe organizations from Taiwan and Hong Kong, from the Philippines and Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia, came up and shook his hand and extended to him symbolically that forgiveness that he was seeking. What is so astounding to us as Americans as we think about this, he was not even born when World War II happened. His father was a teenager who had just been drafted when the war ended. And yet he, because he was Japanese, felt the responsibility of needing to ask for that forgiveness on behalf of his people. Min Young, you were there, I think. You may well have participated and shook his hand in forgiveness as well. So that group identity, we are more than just individuals in these situations. Part of our identity are the groups that we are identified with. it's not just, we are not just individuals. We don't just have individual attitudes and individual actions for which we're responsible, but as we interact with the world, and particularly we as Americans tend to be oblivious of this because we are so focused on the individuality dimension of our lives that we don't recognize that when we go and interact with others, we carry with us an identity based on the groups that we are bonded to and we're associated with. Of course, our organizational affiliation is the obvious one. You know, the fact that we as leaders in particular carry with us, as Chris talked about, the stewards of the reputation of the organization. We, in some sense, carry that with us as we interact with others. But in addition, there are other kinds of groups. We think about nationality. The fact that those of us who are Americans carry that brand, that label with us when we interact with other people. All of us have a nationality, and like it or not, our nation's reputation is carried with us when we interact with other people around the world. Race is an issue. It is an issue that has not gone away in this world. And gender continues to be an issue, something that we talk about and that needs to be addressed. These things are part of what are brought with us. Our American individualism screams at this. We want to believe that if our personal attitudes are right and our own personal actions are right, that everything's right. And it's just not the case. There are other issues that come with us because we are associated with other groups, other cultures that are more sensitive to group identity and to group and to community understand this far quicker than we do in the United States. So when we as Americans enter into these intercultural relationships, often, never maybe too strong, but it's not very much too strong. But most of the time, in my experience, you don't start with a clean slate. When you come into a relationship, you come carrying the interpersonal baggage of the groups that you represent. And that's part of the power, particularly when you represent powerful groups. When you're a citizen of the world's last remaining superpower, when you represent a powerful organization, those are groups that's power that radiates into our relationships. It affects things. Okay, so how does group identity affect our external relationships? I'm thinking particularly we relating to those outside of our own organizations. Certainly we are all heirs. As leaders, we're all heirs of the organization's history. You know, when I became the director of our work in Indonesia, I stepped into someone else's shoes who had made decisions, who had built a track record, and there were many benefits that I enjoyed as a result. There were also some downsides, some decisions that were made along the way that I had to live with and work through. That's an inheritance that every leader gets when they come into their position of responsibility. You receive that baton, that stewardship from someone else who has made choices, made choices that you have to live with, that you have to implement, that you have to sometimes correct. But in addition, there's also national history that is affected by all of this. I remember when I was preaching in Manila a couple of years ago, one of the large churches in Manila, and as is the custom in many different churches around the world, after you preach, you stand at the door and you greet people as they leave. And so I was greeting, the people in the congregation as they were leaving, one after the other. There were a couple of thousand of them that were going by, and there was a young Filipino man that was walking through. Was in the line coming through, and when he came to me, he looked straight ahead, ignored my extended hand, and walked out the door. There were so many people going through, I really didn't think anything about it, so I kept on shaking hands until everyone got through. And then about 15 minutes later, he came back in. And he looked at me with this very stern, somewhat angry expression. And he said, when I saw that there was an American in our pulpit, I was furious. I was furious. He said, but that's not an excuse for bad manners. So then he shook my hand and he said, thank you for coming to our church today. Really set me back on my heels. But the reason that it was not what I said that he was reacting to. It was who I was as an American that he was reacting to. I brought something with me that had nothing to do with me personally so much as it was the group that I was identified with. Americans can't work in Vietnam without understanding they were working against a backdrop of all that happened there in the 1960s and 70s. That, you don't go there with a clean slate. And that's true probably for most places in the world that we work. We don't go there with a clean slate. There's an overwhelming factor, an often unspoken one, that we deal with in intercultural work, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And that is the fact that the white Europeans, and including their North American descendants, totally dominated the world's economic and political system for hundreds of years. And that fact is inescapable. And those of us who are from that same heritage, that same Caucasian stock, carry with us, by virtue of our race, some of that message of domination, subjugation, and that is part of our heritage. It's part of what is communicated when people interact with us. That's a hard thing for me as a white American male to say, but I think it's true. It's true in my experience, in my work in Asia. As I think to some extent we can even, when Jose was talking about the relationship between Latin American churches and North America, it's that same kind of heritage that is at work here. It's not that there has been a particular individual in America that does something that causes that reaction. It's the history, that huge North American history in the Western Hemisphere that had created that same kind of ripple. When Pastor James was talking about the sense or the accusation of Christians as being stooges of the colonialists, this is a reflection of the fact that the Christian missionary enterprise was driven along largely by the colonial expansion of the Western powers. That's where much of the 18th, 19th, 20th century Christian missionary effort was driven, right in train with the colonial enterprise. The rest of the world sees it that way. We are the only ones who have the blinders on that can't see that this is what's going on. I remember sitting in my office in Indonesia a number of years ago, and one of my staff members, an Indonesian man, came in again with a very disturbed look on his face one Friday afternoon, and he said, I was just walking to the office and past a mosque, and the imam was on the loudspeaker with his preaching. And he said, Christianity is the religion of colonialism. He said, why in the world would any self-respecting, patriotic Indonesian want to be a Christian? This is a factor, this is power. The history, nationality is a power, it's a message that we have to work with as leaders. This isn't, if we ignore it, then it's a blind spot for us. We are, it would be a gap in our impact awareness. So how does this work out? One of the ways it's been lived out for me has been in the whole area of initiative. As I have related to different partner groups in other places around Asia, one of the questions, whether it's a government official or whether it's a leader of a local NGO, is who's taking the initiative? Who's taking the lead in this? There is a sense that if the Western organization is the one that's bringing the ideas and bringing the suggestions, then they're the ones that are in control. They're telling us what to do, just like they did in the 1800s. And there is a yearning, a desire that the Western organization would take their cue from the local organization, that they would say, this is our agenda, this is what we are wanting to accomplish, would you come alongside and help us to do it and to work and to help us achieve our goals, our agenda. When I have brought the suggestions, I've got the good ideas, I've brought the suggestion, put them on the table. I sometimes have gotten red lights. More often than not, I've gotten a passive acquiescence. Oh, okay, yeah, you are so powerful, you have all the money, you have all these people, we can do this, yes. But there isn't the enthusiasm and the passion that comes when we have heard from them what they want to do, and we're able to get along, get behind them, and make that a reality. I have to confess, this particular thing is enormously exasperating for Western leaders, for me included. I find it very difficult. I find it difficult to hold my tongue. The capital that a leader has is in initiative, proactive, see what needs to be done, figure it out, let's move ahead and accomplish what we need to accomplish. That's where all of our hearts are, and yet in this kind of a context, sometimes those very assumptions, those intuitions work against us. They work against us in terms of what we need to be as God's people and God's servants. So we need a balance somehow in this. I think that there is probably a role for ideas coming from us, but we have to be gentle. We have to be looking for opportunities to defer, to let other people be those that define the agenda and sort out the plan. We need to avoid that bold confidence. The word for the day that came across on the dictionary program that came across a few weeks ago was diffident. I thought that's a good word, to be diffident, to allow others to not be bold, but instead to defer and allow others to move forward. Well, the group identity thing not only affects how we relate to to other groups, but it also there's a dynamic within our own organizations that happens with regard to group identity. Our own internal group history, our ethos, how we go about making decisions, our group life, the customs that we have developed over time within our different groups are things that affect the dynamic when we have more than one, when we are not all monocultural, everyone the same. When we have a multicultural team, that group ethos can be stifling. It can choke out the contribution of some of our other brothers and sisters. Robert's Rules of Order, the town meeting kind of custom of decision making makes a lot of sense in the United States context. And even I've noticed that many of our European colleagues don't have a whole lot of trouble working in that kind of way of talking about issues. It is not the norm for most of the world, and many of our other colleagues feel very uncomfortable trying to participate in that kind of a situation. There's often a majority-minority mindset that develops within our groups, and when we have perhaps an overwhelming number of Americans or Europeans, and then we have a small number of other nationalities on the same team. There is, without any intention or deliberate malice, there can be this sense of majority and minority, and it can be very difficult. The majority is, in my experience, oblivious. They don't realize. They have all the goodwill in the world. They don't realize what is happening and how what is being communicated to their colleagues by the way in which they work. But the minority group can have a very strong sense of isolation, of us, them, and so forth. When you think about it, think if you were on a leadership team, perhaps you were the only woman around the table on a leadership team, and in working through an issue, your opinion, your idea for how a problem is to be solved was set aside. They choose somebody else's idea, and the group goes with that. Inevitably, the thought will cross your mind: was my opinion discounted because of its merits or because I'm a woman? The same thing is true for African Americans. The question will arise: is it because I'm black, or is it because my idea wasn't really as good? That is part of the dynamic that goes on in the multicultural context, in this group identity thing as it plays out within our organizations. One of the things that I've found within my context in leadership is that language of communication, language of business, what language the group works in, is a huge factor. It projects power and control. Within the Wycliffe context internationally, we have chosen most of the time in most places around the world to use English as the language in which we do our business. But that can be an extremely isolating custom to those who don't use English as their first language, who have had to learn it and somehow figure out how to express what they need to express in that language. It's particularly difficult when you combine this with the town meeting kind of a dynamic where you have to process quickly, hear what someone has said, formulate your answer, get up and express it publicly in the free flow of a town meeting context. People who don't speak English as their first language are at a tremendous disadvantage in those kinds of contexts. They will sit quietly and they will try as fast as they can, and by the time they figured out what to say, the conversation's gone on, and then it's irrelevant. I remember the first time when I had one of my Korean colleagues, when I was the director of our work in Indonesia. He had come, and he and his wife had been studying Indonesian for about 5 or 6 months, had come back to my office to talk about their assignment, where they would be working. They were hoping to do translation work in eastern Indonesia. So he sat down in my office, and for the first time in my experience, he opened his conversation addressing me in Indonesian. I thought for a minute. I said, well, okay. And so we conducted the entire interview with both of us using our second language. I think it was tremendously freeing for him because it gave us a level playing field that was instead of he already was dealing with the power dynamic of me being his director and the power dynamic of my nationality. And so the idea that he could relate, we were not having me speak my mother tongue and him having to speak in a second language and try to communicate what he needed to say through that medium was tremendously freeing for him, that we could both use that same, that common language that we both were having to think real hard how to say what we needed to say in that language. Okay. We're going to conclude here. I just have a few thoughts about, and these are some ideas, some things that I want to at least share. They may be helpful for you. They have been helpful for me. One of the things that has been helpful for me to think about with regard to power dynamics and working both within our group, outside our group, is giving space and giving space for truth. Giving space for truth to flow. It is difficult for the weaker party to tell the truth to the stronger party. It is intimidating. It can be frightening. And so this inclination for people to hide the truth from us requires that we as leaders have ears to hear. We have to have ears to hear when someone screws up their courage to tell us the truth, something that's unpleasant. It does take courage to do that, for your boss or a weaker partner to the stronger partner. One of the things that we need in this area in particular is consistency. don't shoot the messenger. When the person comes to you and passes on that bad news, we have got to be very careful not to react negatively to that face to face with the person that comes to us. Because you can react in an open-spirited way every time, but the one time that you close the door will stay closed for a long time, and they won't risk coming back again to tell you the bad news. So you've got to discipline yourself as leaders. We all have to be very careful to remember when someone is willing to tell us the truth like this, we welcome it. We say thank you, and we work with them in those terms. We have those ears to hear. Secondly, with regard to space, absence. Sometimes absence is better. The example that comes to mind, a few years ago, we were having a conference in the Philippines. We had leaders from many different Asian countries coming together to talk about the work of Bible translation, strategic planning, thinking about the future of the work in Asia. And we had table groups, much like these table groups. I was assigned to a table group. So we all sat at the different tables and we had discussion questions and trying to think and formulate ideas for how to move forward. I sat at my table and it only took about 5 minutes for me to realize that everyone else at the table was waiting for me to say what I wanted to say, and then that was what we were all going to agree to. Because I was our Vice President for Asia Operations, I had huge amount of credibility and power in that context. And no one was going to contradict me. Even if I had a lousy idea, no one was going to contradict me. And so I realized, at the end of that session, I got up to the facilitator and said, look, assign me to do something else. I can't be at one of these table groups and for this to be productive. I'll get a report later, but I don't want to be, we're going to lose the contribution of everybody else at that table if I'm there. So let's let them talk, and then we can get the answers later from them in terms of what they really think, instead of what they're trying to figure out what I think. So absence sometimes, we need to sometimes step out. Sometimes let that communication flow and then get the benefit from it in another way. Sometimes secondhand information is good. Sometimes it's good intermediaries. I think one of the very best decisions I made in my early years as the director of our work in Indonesia was appointing someone to be a liaison between my office and our Indonesian staff. She was one of our most senior members. She had been among the families that had opened the work of SIL in Indonesia in the 1970s, and so she enjoyed incredible. She had massive credibility, both with our expat staff, but also with our Indonesian staff. And I asked her, I said, this has got to be your job for me, is for you to be the friend of our Indonesian staff, to get to know them on a personal level, and to encourage them, build enough trust with them that they will tell you the truth about how things are going, to tell you the truth about how things are going in our offices and what they're seeing. So that became her calling. It was not a full-time job, but it became fully a half-time job for her to visit the different offices and to build those relationships, have meals with some of our Indonesian staff. I learned so much that they would never, ever have told me, but they told her, and she could tell me. It wasn't like this was a secret that she was going to tell me, but they could tell her things they would not tell me face to face. It was enormously helpful. So finding ways to, what this felt like to me was building a safe channel. You build those channels so that truth can flow to you as a leader, and safe channels that people are not threatened by what you do. So we're talking about space, giving space. That's one of the things we can do as leaders. Secondly, I want to talk about symbols. It's a nice picture. Symbols are the non-propositional things that we can do to mitigate against power. Symbols are things that aren't necessarily what we say. It's our body posture. It's what we wear. I noted yesterday that I think it was Bob Roberts was talking about people in his congregation who wore Vietnamese dress when they had the event where the Vietnamese people came, and what that communicated. Nobody had to say anything, but what they wore communicated everything. So these symbols, we need to be artisans in this in terms of knowing what the symbols are that will communicate humility and openness. When people are powerful by position, powerful by nationality, by the organization that they work for, then we have to be particularly good students to know what are the symbols that we use that communicate humility, that communicate openness. So one of them is as I mentioned, body language. You saw in the previous slide, I was kneeling. This was at the Songkran New Year's Festival at the Thai Embassy in Manila, and in greeting the ambassador and wishing her a Happy New Year, you pour water over her hands. But the symbol of kneeling is very important in that context in terms of honoring someone who is important, your elder. But body language in other ways. I have a friend that visited in Japan a few years ago and was greeting and networking with a number of Japanese Christian leaders, and his host, who was taking him around and doing the visits with him. At one point, as they were coming in to an appointment, he put his hand lightly on his back, and he whispered in his ear, "Bow lower." Bow lower. You know, these are things that we as Americans won't learn. You know, we have to we have to be told. We have to be told. So, you know, when you go to Indonesia, you're told never to. Men in particular are told never to hold their hands on their hips because it reminds Indonesians of the Dutch colonial period. You never ever hold your hands on your hips like that. So these are our body language kinds of things. You don't, you know, though many of us know not to cross our arms because in a conversation, because it communicates a closeness to that you aren't listening to the other person. But this kind of things. One of the other things with regard to communicating that openness that I've found very helpful is when I take a new job, I rearrange the office so that my visitors, my guests, do not sit across the desk from me. I don't know if your leaders are, that's a very important thing because that is a projection of power. When you are sitting at your desk, and even if the person's sitting in a comfortable chair on the other side, there is still an authority projection of power in that. If you can find ways of sitting that instead project openness and humility and collegiality, that's huge. It's huge in terms of building that fellowship and that sense of that we're all in this together. One of the other things that I've worked on is learning is language and terminology. How do you talk to other people to communicate honor and respect? Going to Japan and using san when you refer to people is very important, particularly to older people. In Indonesia, they have a whole vocabulary for how you talk about and to those who are of higher status, significantly higher status. Those of us particularly in leadership in the intercultural Christian missionary context, and particularly Americans, we have to be the experts in learning how to communicate through language, how to communicate honor and respect. One of the legends in American sports history is Jim Thorpe. I don't know. Are you? Anyone here remember Jim Thorpe? Okay, he was. Hi, Russ. I do too. Okay, gray beards. Anyway, Jim Thorpe was one of the greatest athletes of his era in the United States. Won numerous gold medals in the Olympics that were held in Stockholm. This was prior to World War II. It was in the early 20th century. Jim Thorpe came to receive his gold medals from the King of Sweden. And the king gave him his gold medals and said, "You are a great athlete." And Jim Thorpe stood straight up and said, "Thanks, King." This is an American legend because Americans have throughout our history prided ourselves in not bowing and not, this is part of our heritage. We need to learn in Christian ministry contexts. We need to learn the skill of humbling ourselves in these kinds of ways. One of the other things that helps me that I would like to just share with you with regard to the intercultural context, multicultural team, as we finish up, is that in multicultural teams in particular, slower English helps a great deal. People who are having to scramble to understand what you're trying to say, if you say it slower, use vocabulary that is not as complicated, it is a blessing to your colleagues that you work with. Speak for the group. This is one of the things that I've learned that has been very helpful, is that occasionally as a leader, the group that I am leading may not be ready to engage with something or particularly to apologize. This has been probably the strongest area where this has come out, where I have personally sensed that our group has hurt someone. We've hurt a partner. We have not treated them as we ought. And I know it in my heart, even though the 100 or so people behind me haven't gotten there yet. And I take the responsibility to apologize for everybody and say, we really didn't treat you right in this situation, and I really apologize on behalf of all of us. I have apologized on behalf of the whole corporation of SIL on occasion when I've felt as though we have not treated a partner or even treated an individual as the way we ought to have treated them. And I have tried to be willing to do that and take that responsibility as a leader. That's part of the gift of leadership that God gives each of us, the opportunity to speak His words on behalf of others. And there are times when we need to be bold to do that and lead from the front and say, even when everyone else isn't quite ready, I know we need to do this, and this is what we need to say in this context. Space, symbols, we need to be spiritual. The world, our colleagues around the world are longing for partners who are close to Jesus, who are genuine in their spirituality. We need to invest in this in our own lives. We need to invest in this. When we are involved in Christian leadership, Christian ministry, we are tempted, brothers and sisters, we are tempted to have this be a job. We are tempted to be professional and to execute professionally. As Bob said yesterday, we can do these things without a lot of dependence on the Holy Spirit. And yet the world longs for partners, American partners, who are rooted in Jesus, who really know Him and who desire and who are close to Him day by day. When you are genuinely spiritual, then it will it can drown out that interference that comes from the power asymmetry. How many times have I seen this in my experience in Asia, that being humble and being close to Jesus, communicating, that the spirituality is the great equalizer. Our love for Jesus brings us next to our brothers and sisters, and the power dynamics can get damped down, and it allows for the free flow of fellowship, of truth, and growth in Christ. Being integrity, transparency, genuineness, this builds trust in other people, and we have some place to go. It's true for Christians and non-Christians alike. This is the amazing thing. We've heard this before. I think Pastor James, you mentioned it the other day, is that it does not matter if they are Christians or not. If they see the genuineness in your heart, your love for Jesus, that will generate respect and trust. They know who you are, and they can work with you. Jose referred to Philippians 2, 5 through 11. Just meditate on the scriptures with me for a moment this morning. Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature of God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Therefore God highly exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. As you think about those verses, think about the ultimate example of asymmetry of power. Jesus, the one through whom this whole universe was made, and how he related to mankind. He was the powerful one who chose to humble himself and to make himself low. And as a result of his obedience and his making himself low, God exalted him and used him to make salvation for all of us. So, what Paul said, have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. It's for us as powerful individuals in our organizations. It's for us who represent powerful organizations within the Christian ministry context. Would you allow me to pray for you as we close? Our Father in heaven, our hearts are stirred again as we look at the example of our Savior, who was so powerful and yet humbled himself for us. Father, our heart's desire is to be the leaders that will bring you glory, not by our greatness and the greatness of our actions, but Lord, because we have humbled ourselves and made ourselves available to you. Father, may your Holy Spirit work in each of our hearts, equip us, and fill us for Christ's sake. Amen.